Thank you. Susan?
Hello, I'm Susan Scott-Parker. I founded the first business disability network, the one in the UK, and I'm a strategic advisor to the ILO's Global Business Disability Network, helping companies get their act together on disability in various networks around the world. We set the first standard ever measure of corporates' disability performance across the business back in 2005. And I recently helped the ILO to set up a benchmark, if you like, that's viable, sensible in any jurisdiction. And what else is relevant? Disability ethical AI, as Ansgar said, is actually disability ethical AI, because we were set up to try to bring the reality of disability-related discrimination into the debate about ethical and responsible AI. And I'll just leave it there. Actually, I was very pleased to be asked to join you today because Ansgar was talking about can we learn from experience? And I just wanted to point out that after all, Asimov introduced that first law, remember, do no harm. That was back in 1942. So while my experience doesn't go back quite that far, I just wanted to say it is grounded in being actively involved in monitoring and trying to influence and helping companies to comply with a whole range of standards and disability-related legislation, accessibility, technical standards, benchmarks, maturity models. The list goes on and on. And of course, lately it's been attempting to address the woeful lack of consideration in the debate around ethical and responsible AI of the impact of this technology on people with disabilities. What I've learned, well, it's one thing to have a standard or a piece of legislation or a regulation that's fit for purpose, but what about the regulator? What does a high-performance regulator actually look like? What do they deliver? And when is the problem not the standard, but actually the regulator? Regulators need to understand that a standard, and when I say standard, I'm going to mean regulations, whatever we're putting in place that's trying to address this. They need to understand that the standard is a tool, not the solution. To really simplify, the job is of a regulator to take that tool and try to make the world a better place, because presumably that's why it was needed. Tending the regulation, but not changing the complex system that triggered the need for that regulation isn't good enough. They must at least attempt to drive change on the broader frame or ensure that somebody does. And it may seem to be a bit odd to say this, but regulators need to really believe that their regulations matter. Believe that they will make this world better if those regulators do their job well. However, for example, we see very few equality and human rights bodies around the world who seem to really believe that the disability regulations, for which they're responsible now, are to do with human and employment and consumer rights, just like race and gender is to do with rights. Hands up if you've ever seen a high-profile campaign from your national human rights body telling employers that people with disabilities in work are entitled to reasonable accommodations as a right. I was going to pause and wait for the hands to go up, but I haven't seen that in the UK, where that right has been there since 1994. So to put it bluntly, regulators need to regulate. Now consider, as evidence, if you like, the recent American government research. They focused on their own performance in terms of compliance with Section 508 of their Rehab Act, which since 1998, I stress 1998, requires government to be accessible in terms of their use of technology for the 1 in 4 Americans with disabilities. So they looked at, the websites, the documents, all the indicators, and found that there was a fewer than 30% compliance rate. So 71% in effect non-compliance. Now I interpret that as people working in the Department of Justice, which is, I wanted to also add, because in addition to the non-compliance, listen to this bit. The government report says that their own Department of Justice has not issued its legally required biannual report on this Section 508 since 2012. So what we have is, I think, people working in the Department of Justice who either don't believe that this matters, who don't actually like 508 for some reason, or who have not been permitted to write that report? Have the politicians somehow intervened? Nobody knows. But clearly, no one is regulating the regulator. I asked a distinguished accessibility expert how he would explain the 70% failure, and he said instantly, nobody cares. Well, how do you determine if a regulator cares? And how would you, if there are people in the room who are regulators, are any regulators in the room? Hands up, regulators? One. Oh, well, we'll get your name later, sir. How would you have regulated so that the regulators regulate? And I'm really not being facetious here. Coming back, what are the key performance indicators for a high-performing regulator? We see some indicators from some equality bodies that they regard society as somehow becoming more fair, more equal. But very few actually have regulators that look at their own performance as a regulator, that look at the quality of the support they provide to individuals who claim that they have been harmed, who look at the quality of its messaging, the quality of the way in which it attempts to leverage its leadership and influence. Because, of course, regulators mustn't just understand the societal problem their regulations address. They must be crystal clear who in particular needs to do what in particular, if that problem is to be solved, if we can use the word solved. We don't need vague calls for compliance, or my favorite, of course, is you must be inclusive. What we need is a message from regulators that says these actors need to do this, and we can tell you how. And of course, one of those key actors is procurement. I want to come back to that in just a moment. Regulators must not only have teeth, they must be seen to have teeth, and a few carrots. The teeth and carrots thing I wanted to play with, but I don't know what to do with it. They need the leadership will to use those teeth and the wisdom to know when, and they need to know what to watch for, because their monitoring role here is crucial. How will we, for example, stop discrimination against job seekers with disabilities if the regulators fail to monitor the automated processes with AI all the way through that now routinely discard people with facial disfigurement and so many others? Because the individuals, of course, have no way of knowing that they were harmed by an algorithm and that their life chances have been reduced as a result. So reliant on individuals to take you to court, how is that going to work? So what do high-performance regulators do? Well, if I had one critical success factor, what they do is they change the behavior of procurement. They will fail, whoever the they are in your world. They will fail unless procurement stops buying the stuff, stops buying the products and services that fail to meet whatever standards the regulators put in place. Procurement talk about the red line. Unless this supplier does that, we won't buy. We don't see any red lines yet out there on the accessibility domain, and those regulations have been around the world for years. If their behavior doesn't change, procurement, whatever regulators say and do isn't going to get us where we want to go. So let's focus on that one key indicator and see where all the deliberations of this major conference are taking us. So in summary, and it seems so weird to have to say this, we need regulators who regulate. Is that too much to ask for? And we need the standards for regulator performance to be as robust and explicit as the technical standards they are obliged to be responsible for. And I don't know who is developing those standards, but I'd love to chat. Well, I'm very struck by the word governance, because when I hear governance, I'm thinking the chairman and the board of the water company in the UK that is still systematically pumping tons of sewage into our rivers. So we come back to procurement. This huge gap between the world of the standard setters, the technical experts, and procurement. I hear procurement directors saying, I don't understand the standards. I don't understand what my suppliers are saying, but my in-house customers, the guys in HR, say it's okay. there's no real risk as far as procurement is concerned because the chief executive and the chairman don't know what questions to ask, which would give them the reassurance that actually they are complying or at the very least mitigating risk in a world where the risk as far as a procurement director is concerned isn't visible. I know you're really keen on solutions, Ansgar. I've been trying hard here. I do think we need to look upstream in the long run, because this is a long game. We need to change the way procurement people are trained. We need to get it right up into their training, just as we need to change the way HR are trained. So many key functions in these companies, they need to understand the implication of their particular functional deployment of this technology. Be alert to where the risks are possible, not just probable, because we're seeing unimagined risks, right? And a lot of risk assessment is what is probable. I think, too, we need to understand that much of what is unfair or damaging to the life chances of many marginalized groups is at an individual level, not the data group stuff. So you can argue this process seems to be safe for 80%, but actually for the individual who stammers and that AI tool only gives him 3 minutes for that interview, it's the individual who has been discriminated against. How do you summon your data bias expertise around protecting that individual's right to an extra 15 seconds in that interview? I think, too, we're looking at what is acceptable risk is interesting. If it means I'm never going to get a job because I stammer, is that an acceptable level of risk? I'd really welcome your thoughts, Ashley, on what this word acceptable means. Because when we look around, you know, you've got 1.5 billion people with disabilities, and somehow the risks to their life chances, their ability to access financial services, get life insurance, all the things that at the moment they're systematically really hindered from accessing, those risks don't seem to have penetrated the debate on ethical and responsible AI. So who out there is deciding where the risk lies? But I want to finish by just coming back to the word governance. Until boards have an understanding of the straightforward questions they can ask, and in terms of transparency, the reporting they need, because if the boards are given the detail that constantly permeates these discussions, when you look at the guidance that is around, there's no hope in heck that they're going to look at it. It's just not at all even feasible. But if you can ask 5 questions that would force the Chief Procurement Officer to respond in the way we want him to respond, then perhaps there is hope. And I am encouraged by the European Commission's work on the Accessibility Act that's coming in. Procurement will be required to only purchase stuff that's accessible, and if they can't or won't, if they're going to say no, they have to be able to justify it. And I think then looking at the standards that apply to the justifications will be really important. I would come back to the Department of Justice. When I hear governance, the word, I'm thinking of the chairman of the Department of Justice justifying not meeting their own legal obligations as a regulator. We need to understand how they justify that. And I'm very conscious of the board of the buyers, the Deutsche Bank, IKEA, right? How does the chairman of the board of IKEA know whether or not they are behaving properly? And they don't understand the standards. They wouldn't understand a thing, Ashley, you just said. They don't understand this at all. But there needs to be guidance at that level that says these are the questions. This is to alert you to potential harm to people, potential harm to your own employees, and the potential harm, of course, to your business. I do think the question of liability is important. The more we raise awareness at board level that you will, as IKEA's board, be held liable as well as Microsoft if they get it wrong, or the small IT supplier down the road in Singapore who's just persuaded you that this new way of assessing whether or not the personality of this candidate online meets what you want is actually any good. I love the phrase, the bullshit word, because NYU did some research recently. They looked at 2 packages HR are using to assess your personality and predict that personality to the recruiters based on your word choice in your word choice in your CV or your LinkedIn profile. And actually, Professor Yulia Stoyanovich rang me and said, it's bullshit science, Susan. It's a technical term I've learned is apparently part of your world. And what she's saying is your personality changed completely depending on whether or not they looked at your CV or they looked at your LinkedIn profile. Now, I don't know what kind of standard addresses that, but it's certainly not of interest to any HR directors out there at the moment, right? Because they've been taught that the technology is somehow on the market. The suppliers don't have to prove it's safe before they can sell it. And the HR people don't understand discrimination in this regard, so you've got market failure. And I guess I wanted to finish by saying we're actually interested in whether or not you've got a system where individuals can seek redress, because if individuals can't seek redress, doesn't matter. The unfairness will spread. And of course, we're interested in whether or not, in HR in particular, which has been our focus, the suppliers of HR products shouldn't be required to put hazard labels on. Just like when you buy aspirin, it has to list potential side effects. So when I buy this piece of kit, potential side effect is these individuals from these populations are likely to be at risk. They'll never get a job if you use this technology because you didn't look at the impact of visual impairment, autism, or whatever when you were designing this product. I like hazard labels. I've got some great ones designed with, skull and crossbones and stuff, to get the attention of the buyers. I'm not pretending for a minute that you would put hazard labels on these products, though I would be tempted to ask why not. But if I can get the buyers to go, what do you mean, hazard labels? Then maybe they'll start to think about the hazards, and they're not thinking about them yet at all. I like the fact that European legislation is talking about liability, because it has to be at the very least shared liability between the buyer, who has recklessly procured this stuff without looking into the damage it might cause, and the buyers who put it on the market without looking at the standards and so on that it should have adhered to.